Hey guys, tonight we are going to take you somewhere very far away and very long ago, and we are going to find out, gently and with a good deal of affection, why you would not have lasted a single day there. The place is ancient Egypt, the land of the pharaohs and the pyramids and the great slow river, 5,000 years ago and more. And the honest truth, the funny and rather humbling truth, is that if you were picked up out of your warm bed tonight and set down on the banks of the Nile in the age of the pyramids, you would be in very serious trouble almost at once. And I want to be clear about what kind of story this is, right from the start, because it matters. This is not a story about how soft you are, or how weak, or how the ancient Egyptians were tougher or better than you. Not at all. It is a story about how astonishingly, specifically adapted a human being becomes to the exact world they grow up in, and how completely lost they would be in a different one. You would not last a day in ancient Egypt. But here is the fair and important other half of it, which we will keep coming back to. An ancient Egyptian, picked up from the banks of the Nile and set down in your world, in your city, with your machines and your roads and your strange glowing screens, and your endless baffling rules, would not last a day either. They would be just as lost as you. You are not worse than them. You are simply made for a different world, as they were made for theirs. And tonight, we are going to explore, kindly, just how different those two worlds really are. So, before you get comfortable, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always 2 in the morning somewhere. Also, thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are. And if this channel helps you drift off, tap the like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim those lights. Switch on a fan for some sweet background hum and get comfortable, because we have a long and gentle journey ahead of us tonight, back through all the long centuries, past the Romans, past the Greeks, back and back to a world of golden sand and green riverbanks and vast blue sky, to the land of ancient Egypt, and let us see, gently, how you would fare there. Let us begin at the very beginning, with the first hour, because you would be in difficulty before the first hour was even out, and understanding why tells you almost everything about the gulf between your world and theirs. Picture it. You arrive somehow on the banks of the Nile at midday in the season the Egyptians called Shemu, the dry season, the time of harvest and heat. And the very first thing, before anything else, before you have taken 10 steps, is the sun. The Egyptian sun, at midday, in a cloudless sky, is not the sun you know. It is a vast, white, hammering presence, pressing down on the land with a weight you can almost feel, and the heat comes up off the sand as well as down from the sky, so that you are cooked from both directions at once. Now, an Egyptian standing beside you barely notices it, and this is the first great lesson of our night, so let us sit with it. That Egyptian has spent their entire life in this heat. Their body has adapted to it in 100 small ways you cannot see. They know, without thinking, exactly how to move in it, slowly, in the heat of the day, resting in the shade when the sun is highest, working in the cool of the morning and the evening. They know how much water they need and where to find it, and they have been drinking it steadily all their lives. They wear the right things, light linen, loose and pale, and they keep their heads covered. They have, in short, a lifetime of built-in, invisible knowledge about how to survive in this exact furnace. Knowledge so deep they are not even aware they have it. And you have none of it. You step out into that midday sun in whatever you were wearing when you fell asleep, with no hat, no linen, no shade, no plan, and no idea how much trouble you are already in. You do the thing a modern person does, which is to keep going, to press on, because you are used to a world where the temperature is managed for you, where you step from a cool house to a cool car to a cool building, and the weather is something that happens on the other side of the glass. You have never in your life had to actually survive the sun. And so you would, in all likelihood, within a couple of hours, be well on your way to heat stroke, dizzy and confused and stumbling, long before you had begun to solve any of the other problems that were waiting for you. And that is the whole shape of tonight, right there in the first hour. It is not that you are weak. It is that you are missing a lifetime of adaptation to a world that does not forgive the unadapted. The Egyptian's body and mind are a set of tools perfectly fitted to that furnace of a land, tools built up over a whole life. You arrive with none of the right tools at all, and the land does not wait for you to learn. And notice, before we go on, how quickly and how quietly that first crisis would come upon you. There would be no drama to it, no obvious moment of danger, nothing to alarm you into caution, just the sun and the heat, and you walking about in it as you might walk about on a warm day at home, feeling perhaps a little uncomfortable, a little flushed, and thinking nothing of it. And all the while, invisibly, your body would be losing the quiet battle, your core temperature creeping up, the water draining out of you faster than you knew, until quite suddenly you were not well at all, dizzy and sick and confused, and by then it might already be too late to easily recover. That is how the heat kills, gently and without warning, and it is exactly the kind of danger that a lifetime of adaptation teaches you to feel coming, and to head off long before it arrives, and exactly the kind of danger that you, lacking that lifetime, would walk straight into without ever seeing it come. The Egyptian would have felt it long before it became dangerous, would have known, in their body, the exact moment to seek the shade, to rest, to drink, to stop. That knowledge is not conscious. It is not something you can be told in a sentence and then possess. It is built into the body over years, a deep automatic wisdom about one's own limits in that particular heat. And it is the difference between life and death. And it is precisely the kind of thing that cannot be handed to a newcomer, only learned the slow, hard way, over a lifetime you would not have. Let that first hard hour and that hammering sun settle gently in the dark. We turn now to how the Egyptians actually dressed for that furnace, and to all the quiet cleverness of survival that you would arrive without. Let us stay with the sun a little longer, because the way the Egyptians clothed and carried themselves against it is a small masterclass in living with heat, and it shows you, in one more way, just how much invisible skill went into simply surviving an ordinary Egyptian day. Look at what they wore, and why. Linen. Almost everything was linen, woven from the flax that grew along the Nile, and linen is one of the best fabrics ever discovered for keeping cool in fierce heat. It is light, it breathes, it lets the air move against the skin, it dries quickly, and the Egyptians made it in every weight, from heavy and coarse to a fine, near-transparent gauze, so light it was like wearing woven air. And they wore it loose, and pale, white and undyed for the most part, because pale colours turn away the sun's heat instead of drinking it in. Everything about Egyptian dress was quietly, perfectly engineered for the climate, worked out over thousands of years of living in that heat, refined into a way of clothing the body that kept it as cool as anything possibly could, and they understood shade and timing in a way you would not. The rhythm of the Egyptian day was built around the sun. Work happened in the cool of the early morning and the later afternoon, and the fierce middle of the day was for rest, for shade, for staying still and quiet, while the sun hammered down, and then returning to work as it softened toward evening. This was not laziness. It was survival wisdom, the correct and necessary way to live in that heat. And everyone knew it, and everyone lived by it, the whole society breathing in time with the sun. They kept their heads covered, and sought the shade of walls and trees and awnings, and drank steadily through the day, and moved slowly when the heat was high, and knew, in their bodies, the exact price of every exertion under that sun and how to manage it. It was a whole art of living with heat, absorbed from childhood, practiced without thought, an invisible competence that surrounded and protected every Egyptian all day long. And you would arrive with none of it. Wrong clothes, wrong colors, wrong fabric, wrong instincts about when to move and when to rest. You would push on through the midday heat because your world has no such rhythm, work when you should rest, wear what you should not, and fail to do the 1,000 small correct things that an Egyptian did automatically. And so the same sun that they lived under comfortably for a whole lifetime would, in a single unmanaged afternoon, bring you down. Not because it was harsher to you than to them, but because they knew how to live with it, in 100 small woven and practiced ways, and you did not know a single one. Let that quiet art of living with the sun settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the thing you would reach for next, the thing that would seem like salvation, and would in fact be one of your greatest dangers, the river itself. So you are hot, dangerously hot, and there, gleaming and beautiful and cool, is the Nile. The great river, the mother of Egypt, wide and slow and green, the most welcome sight imaginable to an overheating person. And every instinct you have would tell you to go to it and wade in and drink deep and cool yourself in that lovely water. And that instinct would be, in several different ways at once, a catastrophe. Let us start with the drinking, because you would be desperately thirsty by now. You would cup your hands and drink from the Nile, as it seems the most natural thing in the world to do. And in doing so, you would be swallowing water absolutely teeming with things your body has never met. The Nile was the source of all life in Egypt, and it was also, from the point of view of your unprepared modern gut, a kind of living soup of bacteria and parasites and microscopic dangers, every one of them foreign to you. And here, again, is the great theme of our night. The Egyptian drinking beside you is more or less fine. Not because the water is clean, it is not, but because they have been drinking it their entire life, and their body has, at great cost over many years, come to a kind of wary truce with the things that live in it. They carry a lifetime of hard-won resistance. You carry none. The same mouthful of water that barely troubles them would, in you, very likely unleash a violent sickness within a day or two, the kind of ferocious illness that empties a body of its fluids, which in that heat, with no clean water to replace them, is a genuinely mortal danger. The very thing you drank to save yourself would be one of the things most likely to kill you. But the drinking is not even the worst of it, because there is a thing living in that gentle water that is one of the quiet horrors of the ancient world, and it does not even wait for you to drink. It comes in through your skin. It is a tiny parasite, a little flatworm, and it lives part of its life inside certain snails, in the still and slow-moving water at the river's edge, and part of its life inside human beings. And when you wade into that lovely cool water to escape the heat, the tiny larval worms released from the snails simply bore in through the skin of your legs, painlessly, without your ever knowing, and begin their long, slow life inside you. The disease is called schistosomiasis, or bilharzia, and it was one of the most common afflictions in all of ancient Egypt. When scientists examine Egyptian mummies today, they find the signs of it again and again, in a majority of the bodies they test, so that we can say with confidence that a very large part of the entire population carried this parasite, quietly, for their whole lives. It caused a slow chronic illness, a steady draining of strength and health, and it was simply an ordinary background fact of existence, something almost everyone had, endured without ever understanding what it was or where it came from. And once again, the Egyptian has a kind of grim adaptation even to this. Their body, exposed to it since childhood, has reached its own uneasy accommodation with the parasite, a chronic low-level burden they have carried so long it is simply part of them. You, wading in fresh, would be newly infected, your body reacting far more violently to the first invasion than theirs does to the familiar old one. The river that is life itself to them would be, to you, A beautiful trap, cool and inviting, and full of quiet dangers your body has no idea how to meet. Let that lovely, treacherous river settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the deeper truth beneath all these dangers, the great invisible war between a body and the world it grows up in, and why yours would be fighting on the wrong side. Let us pause on the deepest reason of all that you would struggle in ancient Egypt, because it runs underneath everything else we have said, and it is one of the most quietly astonishing facts about being a living creature. Your body is not a fixed and finished thing. It is shaped, constantly, all your life, by the exact world it lives in, and above all in the great invisible war it wages with the tiny living things around it. From the moment you are born, your body begins meeting the particular germs and parasites and microbes of your particular world, and fighting them, and learning them, and building up, at great cost, a vast and detailed set of defenses, precisely tailored to the enemies it actually faces. Your immune system is not a general-purpose shield. It is a specific, hard-won, deeply personal record of every battle your body has fought, a detailed defense built to match the exact dangers of the exact world you grew up in. And the Egyptian's body had spent a lifetime building its defenses against the dangers of the Nile, against the particular parasites in that water, the particular fevers of that land, the particular microbes of that world. Their bodies were fortresses raised specifically against the enemies of ancient Egypt, every wall built in response to an actual attack, over a whole lifetime of exposure, beginning in infancy. They carried, in their very blood, the accumulated defensive wisdom of a life lived in that exact place, a wisdom written not in the mind but in the body itself, in the immune system's deep memory of every foe it had met and mastered. And your body has built its fortress against an entirely different set of enemies. The germs of your world, the sicknesses of your time and place, the particular microbial landscape of modern life. Your defenses are magnificent and specific and utterly wasted on the Nile, because they are built against enemies that are not there, while the actual enemies of ancient Egypt, the parasites and fevers and microbes of that world, are ones your body has never met and has no defenses against at all. You would arrive with a fortress built for the wrong war, its walls facing the wrong direction, and the diseases of Egypt would come at you from the undefended side and find you open, exactly as the diseases of your world would come at an Egyptian and find them open, each of you naked before the other's ordinary sicknesses. This is why travelers have always sickened in strange lands throughout all of history, why moving between worlds has always carried this hidden danger. It is not weakness, it is the deep specificity of the body's defenses, built for home and helpless abroad. And it is perhaps the single most important reason that you would not last a day in ancient Egypt, deeper than the sun or the snakes or any of the visible dangers. Your very blood would be in the wrong world, defending you against enemies that were not there, while the real enemies poured through the undefended walls. Your body, that magnificent fortress, would simply be built for somewhere else, and it is worth resting on the strange beauty of that as you drift, that you carry, right now, in your own body, a detailed and invisible map of the exact world you have lived in, written in your defenses, a record of your whole life's quiet battles. You are fitted to your world all the way down, into your very blood, more deeply and specifically than you ever knew. And so was the Egyptian, to theirs. Two fortresses, each perfect for its own siege, each helpless in the other's war. Let that deep bodily wisdom settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the water in another form, and to the great animals that lived in it, and to the surprising truth about which of them was the real killer. Let us stay by the river, because even if you avoided the parasites and did not drink the water, the Nile held larger dangers, and the ancient Egyptians feared them, and you would be right to fear them too, though perhaps not in the order you would expect. The one you would be watching for, of course, is the crocodile, and you would be right to watch for it. The Nile crocodile is a genuinely fearsome animal, huge and ancient and patient, and it does regard a human being as a perfectly reasonable meal, and it kills people, then as now. The Egyptians knew this intimately. They had a crocodile god, Sobek, powerful and dangerous, because that is how you deal with a thing you fear that much. You make it a god. They watched the water. They knew the places where the crocodiles basked and lurked. They had a whole body of knowledge passed down and lived with, about how to share a river with an animal that might eat you, and where and when it was safe to approach the water, and where and when it absolutely was not. You, of course, would have none of that knowledge. You would not know the signs. You would not know which stretch of bank was safe and which was a killing ground, which still patch of water hid a set of watching eyes. You would blunder down to the river's edge, in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time, because you had no way of knowing any better, and the crocodile, patient and silent, would not give you a second chance to learn. But here is the thing that surprises people, and it is one of the great facts of the Nile, and it upends what you think you know. The crocodile was not the deadliest animal in that river. The deadliest animal, the one that killed more people than the crocodile, more people than almost anything, was the hippopotamus. We think of the hippo as a fat, comical, harmless creature wallowing sleepily in the mud. This is one of the great and dangerous misunderstandings a modern person carries. The hippopotamus is, in truth, enormously aggressive, astonishingly fast, both in the water and on land, and fiercely territorial, and it kills more people in Africa than any other large animal. It does not want to eat you, which is small comfort, because it will attack you anyway, to drive you off. And a creature that size, moving that fast, with a bite that powerful, does not need to intend your death to cause it. The Egyptians understood this perfectly. They feared the hippopotamus deeply, and rightly, and it appears again and again in their art and their beliefs, sometimes as a dangerous force to be warded off, sometimes hunted in a ritual that was partly practical and partly a great symbolic act of protecting order against chaos. They knew that the sleepy-looking giant in the shallows was one of the most dangerous things in their entire world, and you would not know it at all. You would see a hippo and think, on some level, of a cartoon, of a big, friendly, comical animal, and you would not feel the correct and useful terror that a lifetime by the Nile had built into every Egyptian. And that gap in your knowledge, that missing instinct, is exactly the kind of thing that would get you killed, in a world where knowing which animals to fear, and how much, and when, was not a fun fact but a survival skill drunk in with your mother's milk. And it goes deeper than just the hippo and the crocodile, because the Egyptian carried a whole vast library of this kind of knowledge, an entire encyclopedia of the living world of the Nile, learned so early and held so deeply that it was simply part of how they saw. They knew the birds, which were good to eat and which to leave alone, where they nested and when they came and went. They knew the fish of the river, the safe and the dangerous, the good eating and the poisonous, for there were fish in the Nile that could sting or shock or sicken. They knew the plants, which could feed you and which could heal you and which could kill you, the useful reeds and the medicinal herbs and the poisonous berries. They knew the insects, the biting and the stinging, and the merely annoying, and how to live among them. They read the whole living landscape the way you read words on a page, effortlessly, automatically, a fluent understanding built up from birth. And this vast practical knowledge of the natural world, which every Egyptian carried, is something almost entirely lost to a modern person, and its absence would leave you helpless in 100 ways you cannot even anticipate. You do not know which plants are safe to eat because you have never needed to, because your food comes prepared and labelled and guaranteed. You do not know how to read the behaviour of wild animals because you rarely meet any. You do not know the signs of the weather, or the water, or the seasons, in the deep, practical way that a person living close to nature must. All of that knowledge, which kept the Egyptians alive every single day, has drained out of modern life, replaced by other kinds of knowledge suited to our own world, and its absence would be one more thing standing between you and survival on the Nile. The Egyptian was, in the truest sense, an expert in their world, a master of a body of practical natural knowledge so vast and so deep that no modern person could hope to match it. Not because they were cleverer than you, but because they had to be, because their survival depended on it every day, and so they learned it, all of them, from childhood, as naturally as you learn to navigate a city and its machines and its endless written signs. Each of you a master of your own world's knowledge, and each of you an ignorant child in the others, and the Nile would expose your ignorance of its ways within hours, gently or otherwise. Let those great river animals, the feared and the underestimated, settle gently in the dark. We turn now away from the water, to the ground itself, and to the small quiet killers that shared the land with everyone. Let us leave the river and its great dramatic dangers, and turn to something smaller and quieter, and, in its way, just as deadly, because the land of Egypt was full of small living things that could end you, and the Egyptians navigated them with a lifetime's care that you simply would not have. Start with the snakes. Egypt was home to a great many venomous snakes, including some of the most dangerous in the world, the cobras and the vipers and the horned snakes that lived in the sand and the rocks and the fields. The Egyptians knew them intimately. They had spells and remedies and gods associated with them. The cobra, rearing and hooded, was a symbol of royalty itself, worn on the brow of the pharaoh, a sign of deadly protective power, precisely because everyone understood how deadly the real thing was. They knew where snakes lurked, how to watch for them, what to do and not do in snake country, how to move through the world in a way that minimized the daily risk of a fatal bite. And you would know none of it. You would walk through a field, or reach into a shadowed place, or step over a rock, with all the blithe carelessness of someone from a world where a walk outdoors carries no such danger, and you would have no idea that you had just done something an Egyptian child would know never to do. The snakes would not be more common for you than for them. You would simply be infinitely more likely to blunder into one, because you lacked the constant, low, lifelong awareness that kept them alive. And then the scorpions, which the Egyptians feared perhaps even more, in daily practical terms, than the snakes. Scorpions were everywhere, hiding in the cool, dark places, under stones, in shoes, in the corners of houses, and their sting could be agonizing and, for the vulnerable, deadly. The Egyptians had a goddess, Serket, associated with scorpion stings and their healing, which tells you how large a part of daily life this danger was. People knew to shake out their sandals, to be careful reaching into dark places, to watch where they put their hands and their feet, 1,000 tiny habits of caution built up over a lifetime and taught to every child. You would have none of those habits. You would put on a sandal without shaking it out, because why on earth would you shake out a sandal and reach into a dark corner without a thought? And the scorpion, disturbed and frightened, would do the only thing it could. And you would learn, too late and very painfully, a lesson every Egyptian had known since before they could walk. This is the quiet, unglamorous version of the danger, and in some ways it is the most telling. Not the dramatic crocodile, but the scorpion in the sandal, the snake in the field, the small deadly things that a lifetime of careful habit kept mostly at bay, and that would find you almost at once, precisely because you had never needed to learn the habits that everyone around you had absorbed without even noticing. Let those small, quiet dangers in the sand settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a genuine surprise about the Egyptians, the one great advantage they would have over you, which is that they were far, far cleaner than you might imagine. Here is a reversal worth savouring, because for all the dangers of their world, In one important respect, the Egyptians were ahead not only of you arriving unprepared, but ahead of most of the ancient world, and a great deal of the world that came long after. They were fastidiously, devotedly, almost religiously clean. Cleanliness for the Egyptians was not merely a matter of comfort or vanity. It was bound up with religion, with purity, with the proper order of things, and above all it mattered intensely for the priests, who had to be ritually pure to approach the gods, and who therefore washed constantly, several times a day, and shaved the hair from their entire bodies, and observed elaborate codes of cleanliness. But the concern for cleanliness ran far beyond the priesthood, through the whole of society, so that ordinary Egyptians too washed frequently, valued clean linen, and cared a great deal about personal hygiene in a way that many later peoples simply did not. They bathed often, in the river or with water poured from jars. They had a kind of soap-like cleansing paste, made from natural materials. They were, famously, careful about the hair, with many shaving their heads, partly for coolness and partly for cleanliness, to be rid of the lice and the dirt that hair collects in such a climate, and then wearing wigs on formal occasions, elaborate and beautiful wigs that could be removed and cleaned, and that kept the head cool and free of vermin at once. They used cosmetics that were not merely decorative, the famous dark eye paint, the kohl, which lined the eyes of Egyptians of every rank, and which, beyond its beauty, seems to have had real practical value, reducing the sun's glare and possibly even helping to protect the eyes against infection. They cleaned their teeth, as we have seen, with the world's oldest known toothpaste, scratchy and imperfect as it was, and they perfumed themselves against the heat, and they kept their homes swept and ordered, and they surrounded the whole business of the body with a care and attention that speaks of a genuinely advanced concern for hygiene. In an age when a great many peoples lived in cheerful filth, the Egyptians stood out as remarkably, admirably clean. So in this one respect, the Egyptians would rather look down on you, arriving grubby and unwashed and careless, from a world where cleanliness comes so easily that you barely think about it. They worked hard at being clean, with much less to work with than you have, because it mattered to them, spiritually and practically both. And it is a fine thing to know about them, and it complicates the picture pleasantly, because it reminds us that ancient does not mean dirty, and that these people, for all the parasites in their river that they could not see or understand, were in the things they could control genuinely and carefully and impressively clean. Let that surprising cleanliness settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the food and the drink you would be offered, and to the surprising reasons that even a simple meal would work against you. Suppose you have survived the sun and avoided the river, and not yet met a snake or a scorpion. You would by now be hungry, and someone might, in the ordinary kindness that people have always shown a stranger, offer you food. And the food of ancient Egypt is a story in itself, and it holds one of the most surprising small miseries of that whole world. The staples were bread and beer. This was the foundation of the Egyptian diet, for rich and poor alike, the two things almost everyone ate and drank every single day. And they were not quite the bread and beer you know. The beer we will come to, because it is wonderful, but the bread, the humble Egyptian loaf, hides a genuinely astonishing fact, one that is written into the very skulls of the people who ate it. Egyptian bread was full of grit. It was full of tiny hard particles of sand and stone, and this was not carelessness, it was more or less unavoidable, and it came from two sources. The first was the desert itself, the fine wind-blown sand that got into absolutely everything in that land, including the grain and the flour. And the second was the grinding. The Egyptians ground their grain into flour using stones, and those grinding stones, working against each other, shed tiny particles of grit into the flour with every push, so that the flour itself, before it ever became bread, was seasoned with a fine dust of stone, and so every loaf of Egyptian bread was faintly, invisibly abrasive, like the mildest imaginable sandpaper, and every Egyptian ate it every day, for their whole life, chewing that grit with every bite. And the effect, over a lifetime, was devastating to their teeth. When we examine the skulls and mummies of ancient Egyptians, one of the most consistent things we find is teeth worn down, ground away, flattened and eroded by decades of chewing gritty bread, worn so far in many cases that the soft inner pulp of the tooth was exposed, leading to abscesses and infections, and the slow agony of dental disease that afflicted an enormous number of Egyptians, rich and poor alike. Even the pharaohs suffered it. We have the mummies of great kings whose teeth were, by the end of their lives, in a genuinely appalling state, worn and abscessed and painful, because even a god-king ate bread with grit in it. It was one of the great levelling miseries of that world, a low, constant, grinding pain, quite literally, that followed people through their lives, that they endured because there was simply no escaping it, and no real cure, only the world's oldest known toothpaste, a scratchy powder of crushed things, and a great deal of quiet suffering. Now, an Egyptian's teeth wore down slowly, over a lifetime, and they were used to the bread, and ate it without thinking. You, arriving fresh, with your soft modern teeth, accustomed to soft modern food, would not have the years to adjust. But that, honestly, would be the least of your worries, a slow danger among the many fast ones. The point of the gritty bread is not that it would kill you quickly. The point is what it tells you about that world, that even the simplest, gentlest, most universal thing, the daily loaf, the food of life itself, carried its own small, quiet suffering, endured by everyone, from the poorest field worker to the pharaoh on his throne. That is how hard that world was. Even the bread bit back. And it is worth pausing on that image of the pharaoh with his aching teeth, because it is such a powerful leveler, and tells you something true about the limits of even the greatest power in that world. We think of the pharaoh as a god on earth, master of the two lands, richer and more powerful than we can easily imagine, and he was all of those things. And yet when we examine the mummies of some of the greatest of them, the mighty kings whose names still echo across the ages, we find mouths full of the same worn and abscessed and agonizing teeth as the humblest of their subjects. All their power, all their gold, all their godlike majesty could not buy them a comfortable mouth, because the grit was in the bread, and even a god-king ate bread. And so even a god-king suffered the slow, grinding agony of the ruined tooth, exactly as his poorest farmer did. There is a strange democracy in that, a reminder that certain kinds of suffering reach everyone, that some hardships are simply part of being a body in a particular world, and cannot be escaped by any amount of wealth or power. The pharaoh and the field hand, united across all the vast distance of their stations by the same toothache, the same grit, the same slow wearing away. And it is a reminder, too, of how much you take for granted, lying there with your own teeth, tended by a dentistry the pharaohs could not have dreamed of, free of a particular constant low pain that even the mightiest of the ancients simply had to endure. Another quiet gift of your world, so ordinary you have never once given thanks for it, and so far beyond the reach of even the god-kings of ancient Egypt. Let that gritty, tooth-wearing bread settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the drink that washed it down, the famous Egyptian beer, which is a far happier story, and one of the great and surprising delights of that ancient world. Here is one of the loveliest facts about ancient Egypt, and a genuine surprise, and a happy thing to rest on for a while. The Egyptians were a nation of beer drinkers, and their beer was not a treat or a luxury or a vice. It was food. It was, quite literally, one of the foundations of life, and everyone drank it, all day, from children to the elderly, and it was one of the good things about being alive on the banks of the Nile. But you must set aside entirely what you picture when you hear the word beer. Egyptian beer was nothing like the clear, cold, fizzy, faintly bitter drink you know. It was thick, it was cloudy and porridge-like, and often quite sweet, sometimes flavoured with dates or honey. It was low in alcohol, so that you could drink it all day without becoming drunk. And it was made from bread, actual bread, partly baked and then crumbled into water and left to ferment, so that the beer and the bread of Egypt were really two forms of the same thing, grain transformed in two different ways. And because it was made this way, it was astonishingly nourishing. It was full of calories and vitamins, and the good things that come from fermentation, so that a working Egyptian could get a real and substantial part of their daily sustenance from their beer. People sometimes call it liquid bread, and that is exactly right. It was a thick, nutritious, mildly alcoholic gruel that fed you as much as it refreshed you, and it had one more enormous virtue, which was that the process of making it, the fermentation, made it far safer to drink than the raw water of the Nile. Without ever understanding the microscopic reasons, the Egyptians had stumbled onto a way of turning their dangerous river water into a safe, nourishing, life-giving drink. So beer was everywhere, and beer was central, and beer was genuinely good for you, and it was one of the great pleasures and staples of Egyptian life. Workers were paid in it. The builders of the pyramids, as we shall see, received a daily ration of several litres of the stuff, and it was part of their wages and part of their sustenance both at once. Temples brewed it in enormous quantities. It was offered to the gods and shared among the living and provided for the dead to enjoy in the afterlife. It flowed through every part of Egyptian life, from the humblest home to the grandest temple. This thick, sweet, nourishing bread beer, one of the quiet triumphs of that ancient world. Now, whether your modern palate would enjoy it is another question entirely. A thick, warm, cloudy, sweetish, gritty gruel of half-fermented bread is perhaps not what you reach for on a hot afternoon, and you might well wrinkle your nose at your first taste. But you would be wrong to, because in that world, that cup of thick, warm beer was one of the best and safest and most nourishing things you could possibly be given, a small daily miracle of accidental science. And if you had any sense at all, once you understood the alternative was the raw river, you would drink it gratefully and ask for more. Let that thick, nourishing beer settle gently in the dark. We turn now to where the Egyptians lived, to the houses of mud and the clever comforts within them, and to why even a simple night indoors would puzzle you. Where would you sleep in ancient Egypt if you survived to nightfall? In a house of mud, most likely. And the ordinary Egyptian house is another small marvel of living wisely in a hard land, and worth a gentle wander as you grow drowsy. The houses of ordinary Egyptians were built of mud brick, made from the Nile mud itself, mixed with straw, and shaped and dried in the sun, the cheapest and most abundant building material imaginable, lying ready in endless supply along the river. And mud brick, humble as it sounds, is genuinely well suited to that climate. Its thick walls are wonderful insulation, staying cool through the hammering heat of the day, and holding a little warmth through the surprising chill of the desert night. A mud brick house is a naturally cool refuge from the sun, and it cost almost nothing but labour to build. And when it eventually wore away, as mud brick does, you simply built another on top of the old, which is why the ancient towns of Egypt slowly rose over the centuries on the accumulated mud of all the houses that had gone before. Inside, the ordinary house was simple. A few rooms, small windows set high to let out the heat while keeping the fierce light and the blowing sand at bay. The floors were often just packed earth. Furniture was sparse, low stools, reed mats, simple beds, chests for storage, though the Egyptians made these things with real care and skill, and even a modest household had its comforts. And crucially, the Egyptians lived much of their life on the roof and in the courtyard, out of doors, because in that climate the outdoors was often the most comfortable place to be, especially at night. Families cooked and gathered, and very often slept up on the flat roofs of their houses, under the enormous desert stars, where whatever breeze there was could reach them, and the stored heat of the day could not. Sleeping on the roof under the stars, in the cool of the desert night, after the ferocious heat of the day, does sound rather wonderful, and it was perhaps one of the real pleasures of Egyptian life. But you would have to get there first, and know to do it, and know how to make yourself comfortable in a world without any of the bedding and cushioning and climate control you take for granted. The Egyptian, lying on a reed mat on a mud brick roof, with a wooden headrest under their neck, was perfectly comfortable, at home in their world. You, given the same mat and the same wooden headrest, that curious curved block of wood the Egyptians rested their necks upon in place of a pillow, would spend a mystified and uncomfortable night, unable to work out how anyone could possibly rest like this, missing the soft bed your body had been shaped to expect. And that, in its small way, is the whole lesson once more, right down to the manner of sleeping. Even rest, even the way a body lies down at the end of the day, is something learned, something fitted to a world. The Egyptian was comfortable in their world in ways you would not be, down to the very block of wood beneath their head. And you are comfortable in yours, in the soft bed you lie in now, in ways they would have found just as strange. Let those cool houses of mud and the sleepers on the roofs settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the greatest and most famous work of that whole world, the building of the pyramids, and to the surprising truth about who actually built them. Now we come to the pyramids, because you cannot think of ancient Egypt without them, and because there is a myth about them so widespread and so stubborn that we must gently take it apart, and the truth underneath is far more interesting and far more human than the myth. The myth is the one you have seen in 100 films. Vast armies of slaves, toiling under the whip, dying in their thousands, dragging the great stones in endless suffering chains, while cruel overseers lashed them onward. It is a powerful image, and it is almost entirely wrong, and it comes, as it happens, from a single ancient Greek traveller named Herodotus, who visited Egypt when the pyramids were already more than 2,000 years old, and wrote down the stories he was told, and got a great deal of it muddled. The image of the slave-built pyramid stuck for 25 centuries, and Hollywood loved it, and it is only in recent decades that archaeology has quietly and thoroughly overturned it. Because when archaeologists actually dug at Giza, at the foot of the Great Pyramids, they found the remains of the workers, and the story their bones and their village told was not the story of slaves at all. They found a whole town, a purpose-built settlement, where the builders lived. They found bakeries and breweries and kitchens working on an industrial scale to feed the workforce. They found that the workers ate well, remarkably well, with a steady supply of bread and beer and a genuinely large amount of meat, cattle, and sheep and goats driven to Giza from across the land to feed them. They found evidence of medical care, of broken bones that had been set and healed, of workers who had been looked after when they were hurt. And most tellingly of all, they found the tombs of the workers, built right there in the shadow of the pyramids they had raised. Slaves are not buried in honor beside the monuments they die building. These people were. They were given proper burials, with provisions for the afterlife, in their own tombs near the pyramids, an honor that tells you these were not disposable chattels but respected workers, proud of what they did and honored for it, in life and in death. So who were they? They were, for the most part, ordinary Egyptians, farmers, largely. And here is the beautiful piece that ties it all together and explains everything. For part of the year, when the Nile flooded, the fields of Egypt vanished under water, and the farmers could not farm. Their land was under water, their work suspended, waiting for the flood to recede. And it was in exactly this season, the flood season, when the farming population was idle and could not work its fields, that the great building projects drew in their workforce. The farmers came in their thousands and worked on the pyramids and the temples during the months when they could not work their land, and were fed and paid and housed and cared for, and then returned to their fields when the waters fell and the soil emerged, fertile and renewed, ready for planting. It was, in a sense, a vast national public works program, brilliantly timed to the rhythm of the river, employing the idle farmers of the flood season in raising monuments to their gods and their kings, and feeding them well and honouring them for it. Not a story of whips and chains and suffering slaves, but a story of organised, fed, paid, respected labour, woven into the great cycle of the Nile itself. It is a far better story than the myth, and it is true, and it tells you something genuinely admirable about that ancient world. And think what it must have meant to those farmers, to be part of it, to leave your flooded fields and travel to Giza, and there to join thousands of others in raising something so vast, so far beyond anything any of you could build alone, a mountain of stone reaching for the sky, a thing that would still be standing, still astonishing the world, thousands of years after you and everyone you knew was dust. There is a pride in that which comes down to us across the ages, in the graffiti the work gangs left behind, the names they gave themselves, cheerful, boastful names, the friends of Khufu, the drunkards of Menkaure, teams of men who competed and joked and took pride in their labour and left their marks upon the stones. These were not broken slaves. They were working men, proud of the greatest work of their lives, part of something magnificent, and they knew it. And the scale of the organisation behind them is almost as astonishing as the pyramids themselves. To feed and house and supply a workforce of that size, in that place, for that long, required an administrative machine of extraordinary sophistication, the growing and gathering and transporting of vast quantities of grain, the herding of thousands of animals across the land to the site, the brewing and baking on an industrial scale, the quarrying and moving of the stone, the housing and organising and paying of the workers, all of it coordinated and recorded and managed by the scribes and officials of a state that could marshal the resources of a whole kingdom and point them at a single enormous task. The pyramids are not just a marvel of building, they are a marvel of organisation, proof of a society that could plan and coordinate and sustain an effort of staggering complexity. And that, too, is written into every one of those great stone monuments. So when you look at a pyramid, do not think of suffering slaves under the lash. Think of those proud work gangs with their boastful names, well fed on bread and beef and beer, honoured in life and in death, raising their mountain of stone in the flood season, and returning to their fields when the waters fell. Think of the vast humming machine of organisation behind them. Think of a whole society, briefly, pointing all its enormous energy at the raising of something eternal. It is a far grander and far more admirable and far more human story than the myth of the whips, and it is the true one. Let those honoured pyramid builders settle gently in the dark. We turn now to what that work was actually like, and to why, even as a paid and honoured worker, you would have struggled terribly to do it. So the pyramid builders were not suffering slaves, but that does not mean the work was easy, and if you, a modern person, were set to labour among them, even as a well-fed and honoured worker, you would struggle in ways that would quickly become clear, and it is worth understanding why, because it is the same theme again, in a new form. The work was brutally hard, whatever the exact methods, and there is still a great deal we do not fully understand about how the pyramids were raised. It involved moving colossal quantities of stone, enormous blocks, by human muscle and clever engineering and sheer organised effort under that hammering sun, day after day. The bones of the workers show it. Their skeletons bear the marks of a lifetime of heavy labour, worn joints, arthritis, spines compressed and damaged by the carrying of great weights. This was work that shaped and marked the very bones of the people who did it. And they could do it because they had been doing hard physical work their entire lives. An Egyptian farmer's body was a tool built by decades of labor, of hauling water and working fields, and lifting and carrying, under that same sun, from childhood onward. When they came to build the pyramids, they brought bodies already hardened and adapted to exactly this kind of effort, in exactly this kind of heat. It was harder than their farming, no doubt, but it was the same fundamental kind of thing, and their bodies knew it. Yours does not. However fit you might be by the standards of your own world, your fitness is a different kind of fitness, built for a different kind of life. You have almost certainly never done hard physical labor, all day, every day, in extreme heat, with your bare hands and your back, for weeks on end. Your body has never been asked to become that specific tool. And so, dropped among the pyramid builders, you would find within hours that muscles you did not know you had were failing, that the heat was defeating you, that the sheer relentless physical grind of it was beyond what your unprepared body could sustain. You would not be lazy or weak in any moral sense. You would simply be, once again, unadapted, a body built for one world asked to perform in another. And here, as always, turn it around, because it is only fair. Take one of those pyramid builders, one of those hardened, capable, heat-adapted men who could haul stone all day in the sun, and set him down in your world, and ask him to do your work. Put him in front of a screen and ask him to fill a spreadsheet, or navigate a city of roaring traffic and baffling signs, or operate the machines that your life runs on, and he would be as lost and as helpless as you would be at Giza. His lifetime of hard-won skill would be suddenly useless, his deep knowledge irrelevant, and he would stand there as bewildered by your world as you would be by his. Neither of you is better. You are just tools shaped for different work, and each of you would be blunt and useless in the other's world. Let that hard and honorable work settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a barrier you would hit before any of this, one that would isolate you completely, the simple fact that you could not understand a single word. Here is a problem we have skipped over, and it is one of the first and largest you would actually face, so large that it is easy to overlook. You would not be able to speak to anyone, not one word. You would be, from the first moment, utterly and completely cut off from every person around you, alone in a crowd, unable to ask for help, or explain yourself, or understand a single thing that was said to you. The Egyptians spoke a language that is entirely, completely dead. Ancient Egyptian is not the ancestor of any language you know. It is related, distantly, to some modern language families, but the actual tongue the pyramid builders spoke has no living descendants you could lean on, no familiar words to grab onto, nothing your ear could catch. It would be pure, unbroken noise to you, a flowing stream of sounds carrying meaning you could not begin to access. And the writing, the famous hieroglyphs, would be no help at all, even setting aside that you almost certainly could not read them. Because here is a thing worth knowing. The vast majority of Egyptians could not read them either. Literacy in ancient Egypt was a rare and precious and jealously guarded skill, possessed by a tiny fraction of the population, the scribes, the priests, the officials, an elite of the literate, in an ocean of people who could not read a single sign. Writing was power, and it was restricted, and to be a scribe was to hold one of the most valuable and respected positions in the whole society, precisely because so few could do it. So the hieroglyphs carved so beautifully into every temple and tomb, which to us are the very image of ancient Egypt, were, to most ancient Egyptians, as mysterious and inaccessible as they would be to you. They were sacred, powerful, the words of the gods, but unreadable to the ordinary farmer or builder, who lived their whole life surrounded by writing they could not decode, trusting the scribes and priests to hold that power on their behalf. And you would stand in that same ocean of incomprehension, unable to speak, unable to understand, unable to read, cut off by an absolute wall of language from every soul around you. And think how helpless that would make you, on top of everything else. You could not ask where it was safe to drink, or which water hid the parasites, or where the snakes lurked, or how to survive the sun. All the life-saving knowledge that everyone around you carried and might gladly have shared, you could not reach, because you could not understand a word they said. The language barrier would not just be lonely, it would be one more thing, and a large one, standing between you and survival. And once more, in fairness, turn it around. The Egyptian in your world would face exactly the same wall. Your language would be as impenetrable to them as theirs to you. Your writing as meaningless. Your whole world of words a locked door. They would be as isolated in your city as you would be on the Nile, and for exactly the same reason. It is not stupidity on either side. It is simply the deep, complete, humbling barrier that stands between any two worlds that do not share a tongue. And here is a thing that shows you just how completely their language died, and how nearly it was lost forever. For well over 1,000 years, after the last of the ancient Egyptians, nobody in the world could read the hieroglyphs. The knowledge simply vanished. The old religion faded. The temples fell silent. The last person who could read the sacred signs died, and the meaning drained out of them entirely, so that for century after century, the beautiful hieroglyphs covering the monuments of Egypt were pure mystery, gazed at by travelers and scholars who had no idea whatsoever what they said. People invented fanciful theories, imagining the signs to be mystical symbols, secret wisdom, magical pictures, anything but what they actually were. A real writing system, recording a real language. The words of a whole civilization sat there in plain sight, carved in stone, utterly silent, their meaning lost as completely as if it had never been. And it was only recovered by an extraordinary stroke of fortune and a feat of brilliant scholarship when a stone was found, the famous Rosetta Stone, that carried the same message written in 3 scripts, one of them the lost hieroglyphs, and one of them a known language, so that at last, by patient comparison, the signs could be cracked, and the long silent words could speak again. It took years of painstaking work by dedicated scholars, and when it was finally done, when the hieroglyphs at last gave up their secret, a whole lost world came flooding back into the light, the words of the ancient Egyptians readable once more after more than 1,000 years of silence, their prayers and their records, and their letters and their stories suddenly speaking again across the enormous gulf of time. So the very words that would be so impenetrable to you, standing there on the Nile, were nearly lost to all of humanity forever, and were saved only by luck and genius at the last. And that too is a kind of lesson in the fragility of these things, in how completely a whole world of meaning can vanish, and how precious and hard-won is the knowledge that lets us reach back across the centuries and hear those ancient people speak at all. The wall of silence you would face on the Nile is the same wall that stood for over 1,000 years between the whole modern world and ancient Egypt, until a few brilliant minds found the door in it. Let that wall of silence, and the long labour of breaking it, settle gently in the dark. We turn now, having seen how you would fare, to the other half of our title, and to all the other people of that world who had the very hardest lot, beginning with those who worked in the places no one wished to go. We turn now to the other half of our night, to the people of ancient Egypt who drew the hardest lots in life, the jobs and roles that someone had to fill, and no one can have wanted. And we begin deep underground, in the hot dark, with the men who mined the gold and the stone. Egypt was a land of gold, famously so, and of fine stone, and both had to be dug out of the earth, out of the deserts and the mountains, in some of the most brutal working conditions the ancient world had to offer. The mines and the quarries were often far out in the eastern desert, in places of terrible heat and no water, and the work of extracting the gold from the hard rock was punishing beyond almost anything else in that society. And this is one of the places where the darker side of Egypt does appear, honestly, because much of this work was done by those with no choice, by prisoners, by convicts, by captives taken in war, sent out to the mines as a punishment that was very often a death sentence. There is a surviving ancient account, written a little after the height of the pharaohs, that describes the conditions in the Egyptian gold mines in terms of genuine horror, of people worked without rest in the crushing heat, of the sick and the injured driven on, of a misery so complete that death might come as a release. I will not dwell on it, because this is a gentle hour, and those people deserve their peace, but I will not pretend it away either. The gold that adorned the pharaohs and glittered in the temples was, a great deal of it, dug out of the earth by people living and dying in conditions of real anguish, and honesty requires that we remember them, quietly, before we move on. The quarrymen who cut the great stone had a hard lot too, though often not so purely dreadful, chipping and levering enormous blocks out of the living rock, with copper tools and stone pounders and endless patient labour, out in the heat, far from home. The stone that became the pyramids and the temples and the great statues had to be won from the mountains block by the sweat and strain of these workers, and it was work that used people hard and wore them out. And spare a thought, too, for the expeditions that went out into the deep desert after the finest stone and the precious minerals, journeys of real hardship and danger, marching for days across the burning waste to reach the distant quarries and mines, carrying their water with them, working in places of utter desolation where a mistake or a delay could mean death by thirst, and then hauling their heavy treasures back again across the same terrible ground. These expeditions are recorded in inscriptions the leaders left behind, boasting of the size of the party, the tons of stone brought back, the wells dug along the way, and reading between the proud lines, you can feel the real difficulty and danger of it, the organizing of hundreds or thousands of men to cross a lethal desert and wrest its treasures out and bring them home, losing some along the way, always, to the heat and the thirst and the sheer brutal distance. There is a lesson in this that runs alongside the wonder of ancient Egypt, and it is worth holding gently. All the beauty of that civilization, the golden treasures, the soaring temples, the vast monuments that still take our breath away, all of it rested on an enormous foundation of human labor, some of it honored and well fed, as with the pyramid builders, and some of it, as in the mines, wrung out of people in misery and darkness. The glory and the suffering were woven together, as they so often are in the great works of the ancient world, and to see ancient Egypt truly is to see both at once, the breathtaking beauty above and the human cost beneath. Let those who went into the mountains settle gently in the dark, and let them rest. We turn now to a job that was not deadly, but was so unpleasant in its daily substance that it stood at the very bottom of Egyptian society. Every society seems to have a job that sits at the very bottom, that everyone looks down on, that someone nonetheless must do, and in ancient Egypt, one of the great candidates for that unhappy position was a trade to do with the making of fine linen and the treating of it, and with an ingredient that we would find genuinely startling. To whiten and clean and treat cloth and other materials, and for a range of other purposes in that world, the Egyptians, like many ancient peoples, made use of substances that had to be collected in ways nobody enjoyed. There were workers whose job was to gather and handle these materials, human and animal waste among them, used in the treating of cloth and the tanning of leather and other necessary crafts. And it was smelly, degrading, socially despised work, done by those who had no better options, standing at the bottom of the social ladder, doing the unpleasant necessary things, that kept the finer parts of society supplied with their fine, clean linens and their worked leather. There survives a wonderful and rather cruel piece of ancient Egyptian writing, a text used in the training of scribes, which was essentially a long list of all the other professions a boy might end up in, described in the most off-putting possible terms, precisely in order to frighten young students into studying hard so that they could become scribes and avoid all these dreadful fates. And it is a marvelous window into which jobs the Egyptians themselves considered miserable. It describes the coppersmith with his fingers like crocodile skin, stinking worse than fish. It describes the field worker who never stops labouring. It describes the potter grubbing in the mud, and the reed cutter in the marshes where the mosquitoes and the dangers are, and the launderer washing clothes on the riverbank right next to the crocodiles, and the fisherman on the dangerous water. Every one of these jobs is painted as wretched, dirty, dangerous, or exhausting, all to make the comfortable, clean, respected life of the literate scribe look like the paradise it genuinely was by comparison. And that text tells us so much because it is the Egyptians themselves telling us which lives they thought were hard. Not our guess, but their own judgment, written down to scare their children into ambition. The scribe sat at the top, clean and dry and respected, holding the magic of writing. And below him stretched a whole world of harder, dirtier, more dangerous work, the smiths and potters and washermen, and field hands and reed cutters and waste gatherers, the people who actually made the physical world of Egypt function, each of them looked down upon from above, each of them doing something without which the whole glittering civilization could not have stood. Let those hard and humble trades settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the very top of that working world, to the one job everyone wanted, the scribe, and to why the power to make marks on a page was the most valuable skill in all of Egypt. If the miners and the field hands and the waste gatherers stood at the bottom, then at the top of the working world, clean and dry and respected and comfortable, sat the scribe, and understanding why tells you something deep about that whole society and about the strange and wonderful power of the written word. The scribe could write. In a world where almost no one could, where reading and writing were a rare and precious and jealously guarded skill, possessed by a tiny fraction of the population, the scribe held the keys to something close to magic. Writing ran the whole machinery of the Egyptian state, the counting of the harvest and the levying of taxes, the records of the storehouses, the orders of the officials, the letters that carried the will of the king across the land, the accounts and inventories and contracts, the sacred texts of the temples. All of it depended on the scribes, on the small literate class who could make the marks that held and moved and preserved information. A civilization as vast and organized and enduring as Egypt simply could not function without writing, and so the people who could write were indispensable and knew it, and were honored accordingly. And the life of a scribe was, by the standards of that world, genuinely enviable. He did not labor in the fields under the sun, or haul stone, or wade in the marshes, or grub in the mud. He sat, in the shade, with his reed pens and his palette and his papyrus, and did clean, skilled, respected work, and was paid well for it, and could rise, through the ranks of the administration, to positions of real wealth and power and influence. The very training text we spoke of earlier, the one that painted all the other professions in such miserable colours, existed precisely to drive this lesson home to young students, to make them study, because the reward for mastering the difficult art of writing was escape from all the harder fates, entry into the comfortable, honoured, powerful life of the literate. But that mastery did not come easily. Becoming a scribe meant years of hard schooling, beginning as a young child, long days of memorizing and copying, of learning the hundreds upon hundreds of signs of the Egyptian writing systems, of practicing endlessly on scraps and flakes of stone before being trusted with precious papyrus, all under a strict discipline that, by the accounts that survive, involved a very great deal of stern correction. There is a saying that comes down to us from that world, that a boy's ears are on his back, and he listens when he is beaten, which tells you the flavor of Egyptian education clearly enough. The road to the scribe's comfortable life ran through years of hard study and harsh discipline, and only a fortunate few ever walked it, mostly the sons of those who were already scribes and officials, keeping the precious skill within their families across the generations. So the scribe sat at the summit of the working world, and his position rested entirely on this one magical skill, the ability to capture speech and thought and number in marks upon a surface, to send words across distance and preserve them across time. It is a power so completely ordinary to you, who learned to read and write as a small child almost without noticing, that you can hardly imagine it being rare or precious or magical. But in ancient Egypt it was all of those things, the most valuable skill a person could possess, the key that unlocked the comfortable life, and the quiet engine that made the whole vast civilization possible. And you, who can read these very words, hold as your birthright a power that in ancient Egypt would have marked you as one of the fortunate elite had you only been able to read their signs instead of your own. Let that magical skill of the scribe settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a role that carried great honor and great strangeness together, the people whose work was with the dead. The ancient Egyptians are famous above almost all else for what they did with their dead, for mummification, for the extraordinary care and skill and expense they poured into preserving the body for its journey into the afterlife. And this created a whole profession, a class of specialists whose entire working life was spent handling the dead, and it was a role that mixed high sacred honor with a daily reality most people would find difficult indeed. Mummification was a long, elaborate, deeply skilled process, carried out over many weeks, involving the careful removal of the organs, the drying of the body with special salts, the wrapping in linen with prayers and charms and precious amulets bound between the layers. It was sacred work, essential work, because without it the dead could not properly enter the afterlife, and so the embalmers held a genuinely important place in that society, keepers of one of its most central mysteries, masters of a craft that everyone depended upon and revered, and yet the daily substance of the work, the actual physical handling of the dead, day after day, placed the embalmers in a strange and set-apart position. There is a sense in the sources that those who did the actual cutting of the body, the first incision to remove the organs, occupied a peculiar and slightly shunned role, ritually necessary but somehow tainted by the act, so that the person who made that cut might be ceremonially abused or driven off afterward, in a ritual that acknowledged the necessity of what they did, while also marking it as somehow transgressive. It is a fascinating glimpse of the complicated feelings that surrounded this work, honored and essential on the one hand, unsettling and set apart on the other. The embalmers worked in special places, set aside for the purpose, apart from the ordinary flow of life, and their work went on continually, because people die continually, and every death that could afford it brought another body to be preserved. It was skilled, respected, sacred, well-rewarded work, and it was also a life spent entirely among the dead, in the smell and the substance of mortality, doing for others the last great service that Egyptian belief required. A strange lot, honored and shadowed both at once, and one more of the many particular lives that made up that vast and complicated world. Let those keepers of the dead settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the people who worked the fields, the vast majority of all Egyptians, and to the endless labor that fed the whole of that world. We have spoken of miners and embalmers and scribes, but the truth is that the overwhelming majority of ancient Egyptians were none of these things. They were farmers. The whole of that dazzling civilization, all its gold and temples and monuments and priests and kings, rested upon the patient, endless labor of millions of ordinary farmers working the narrow strip of fertile black soil along the Nile, and their life was the real life of ancient Egypt, the great common experience underneath all the glamour, and it was a life ruled entirely by the river. The Nile gave everything and dictated everything, and its great annual flood was the heartbeat of the whole Egyptian year. Each year, with a reliability that must have seemed like a promise from the gods, the river rose and spread across the land, covering the fields, and when it retreated, it left behind a fresh layer of rich black silt, the most fertile soil imaginable, renewed every single year by the flood. This was the secret of Egypt's wealth, this annual gift of fertility, and it made the Nile Valley one of the great breadbaskets of the ancient world. But it made for a particular rhythm of life, and a hard one. There was the season of the flood, when the fields were under water and the farmers could not farm, and turned to other work, to the building projects, to repairs, to the 1,000 other tasks of the community. There was the season of growing, when the waters had retreated, and the seed was sown in the fresh, wet soil, and the crops came up green across the valley. And there was the season of harvest in the growing heat, when the grain was gathered in a race against time, and the whole population bent to the exhausting labor of bringing in the food that would feed the land for another year. And through all of it, the farmer labored, hauling water in the dry times, working the shadoof, the clever counterweighted pole that lifted water from the river to the fields, an endless repetitive lifting that went on all day, ploughing and sowing and weeding and harvesting, tending animals, repairing the canals and the ditches that carried the precious water, paying taxes in grain to the officials who came to measure the harvest and take the share owed to the temple and the king. It was a life of constant, hard, physical work, from childhood to old age, under the sun, governed by the river, with little rest and less reward. And it was the life of the vast majority of everyone who ever lived in ancient Egypt. And yet it was not, we think, a life without its joys. The same sources that show us the hardness also show us the ordinary human pleasures woven through it. The festivals, the family life, the food and the beer, the songs sung in the fields, the belief in a good afterlife waiting beyond the labor of this one. The Egyptian farmer worked terribly hard, but he worked in a green and fertile land, fed by a reliable river, in a stable society that lasted, in its essential shape, for thousands of years, longer than almost any civilization in human history. There was a deep security in that, under the hardness, a sense that the world was ordered, and the seasons would turn, and the flood would come again, as it always had, as it always would. Let those patient farmers, the backbone of everything, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the great river's yearly rhythm itself, and to how the flood ruled not just the fields but the very shape of time in ancient Egypt. We have spoken of the flood, but I want to return to it, because the annual flooding of the Nile was so central to ancient Egypt that it shaped not just the farming but the entire structure of the year, the calendar, the sense of time itself. And understanding it is understanding the deep heartbeat of that whole civilization, a soothing rhythm to rest upon. Every year, with a regularity that governed all of life, the Nile rose. The waters came down from the far south, from the rains and the melting snows of distant highlands the Egyptians themselves never saw and did not fully understand, and the river swelled and spread and overflowed its banks and covered the black land of the valley. And this flood was not a disaster, as a flood is in most places. It was the opposite. It was the great annual blessing, the thing the whole of Egyptian life depended upon and prayed for and celebrated, because the flood brought the water and the rich black silt that made the desert bloom, that renewed the fields each year and made Egypt the breadbasket it was. And so the Egyptians built their entire year around it, and divided their calendar into 3 great seasons defined entirely by the river. There was the season of the flood, when the waters covered the land and farming stopped and the great building projects drew in their idle labour. There was the season of the emergence, when the waters retreated and left the fresh, wet, fertile soil, and the seed was cast and the crops grew green. And there was the season of the harvest and the low water, when the crops were gathered in, and the river shrank to its narrowest, and the land waited, parched and cracking, for the blessing to come again. 3 seasons, flood and growth and harvest, turning endlessly, year after year, the whole of Egyptian time, shaped by the rise and fall of the water. And the Egyptians watched the river with enormous attention, because everything depended on the flood being neither too little nor too much. A low flood, a weak flood, meant not enough water and not enough new soil, and that meant a poor harvest, and that meant hunger, famine, hard years. And a flood too high meant destruction, villages and stores swept away. The perfect flood, the flood that brought life, was a matter of the most intense concern, watched and measured and prayed for. And there were even structures built to measure the height of the rising water, so that the coming harvest and the taxes to be levied on it could be reckoned in advance from how high the river climbed. There is something deeply steadying in this rhythm, and it is worth resting upon as you grow sleepy. The Egyptian lived within a great reliable cycle, the turning of the river's year, endlessly repeated, endlessly renewed. The flood would come, as it always had. The waters would retreat, as they always did. The seed would grow, and the harvest would ripen, and the river would shrink and rise again, forever, world without end. It was a life governed by a vast, dependable natural rhythm, and there is a peace in that kind of life, under all its hardness, a sense of being held within a great turning order, far larger than oneself, that our own restless world, cut loose from the seasons, has largely lost. The Egyptian farmer, watching the river rise once more on schedule, knew that the world was faithful, and that the blessing would come as it always came, and slept, we may hope, soundly upon that ancient certainty. Let that great turning year, the year the river made, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the women of ancient Egypt, and to a surprising truth about their place in that ancient world. Here is a genuine and pleasant surprise about ancient Egypt, one that stands out sharply against many other ancient societies, and it concerns the position of women, which was, by the standards of the ancient world, remarkably good. Egyptian women, it turns out, held a legal position that would have astonished many other ancient peoples, and indeed many much later ones. They could own property in their own right. They could buy and sell it, inherit it, and pass it on. They could enter into contracts and bring cases in court, and act as witnesses and manage their own affairs. A woman could inherit equally with her brothers. She kept her own property in marriage and could dispose of it as she wished, and if a marriage ended, she was entitled to take what was hers. In legal terms, an Egyptian woman was very nearly the equal of a man, possessed of rights and protections that women in many other times and places could only have dreamed of. This did not mean the society was equal in the way we might hope for. The great public roles, the highest offices of state and temple, were overwhelmingly held by men, and the ordinary division of daily labour largely followed familiar ancient lines, with women bearing the great burden of the household, the raising of children, the grinding of grain and baking of bread, and making of beer and weaving of cloth, the endless domestic labour that sustained every family. A woman's life was hard, as everyone's life was hard, and shaped by expectations we might chafe against. But within that, the legal and economic freedom Egyptian women held was genuinely remarkable, and it shaped their lives in real ways. There were women who ran businesses, who owned and managed land, who grew wealthy in their own right, who went to court to defend their interests and won. And at the very highest level, though it was rare and often controversial, there were even women who ruled, who took the throne itself and governed as pharaoh, the most famous being Hatshepsut, who reigned as a king in her own right, in full pharaonic style, and presided over a prosperous and peaceful and monument-building age. That a woman could, however rarely, rise to the very summit of that world tells you something real about the space women occupied within it. So if you were a woman dropped into ancient Egypt, you would face all the same dangers as anyone, the sun and the river and the snakes and the rest. But you would at least be entering a society that, in its laws and its customs, granted women a dignity and an independence that was genuinely unusual in the ancient world, and that would not be matched again in many places for thousands of years. It is one of the quietly admirable things about that civilization, and worth knowing, and worth resting on with a certain warmth. Let those women of the two lands settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the animals of ancient Egypt, and above all to the creature they loved beyond all others, which shared their homes and their hearts and even their gods. The ancient Egyptians shared their world with a great many animals. Some feared, some worshipped, some worked, and some loved. And their relationship with the animal world is one of the warmest and most appealing things about them, and a gentle subject to grow drowsy upon. Above all, there was the cat. The Egyptians and their cats are famous, and rightly, because the bond was real and deep and genuinely touching. Cats began, no doubt, as useful animals, drawn to the granaries where they hunted the mice and rats that threatened the precious stored grain, and prized for that service in a society that lived and died by its harvests. But the cat became far more than a useful pest catcher. It became beloved, a treasured member of the household, a companion cherished for itself, and eventually sacred, associated with the goddess Bastet, protector of the home and of women and children. Egyptians mourned their cats deeply when they died and had them mummified with real care, and there are vast cemeteries of mummified cats, prepared for their own journey into the afterlife, a sign of how genuinely these animals were loved. To harm a cat was a serious matter indeed, and there are accounts, perhaps exaggerated but telling, of the fury that could descend on anyone who killed one, even by accident. The cat sat at the very heart of the Egyptian home, warm and purring and protected, loved in a way that any modern person who has loved a cat would recognize in an instant, across all the thousands of years. It is one of those bridges between their world and ours, that shared love of the small, warm creature by the hearth, and it is lovely to know that it stretches back so far, that an Egyptian family 5,000 years ago doted on their cat exactly as people do today. And there is a tenderness in the details that survive. Egyptian art shows cats sitting beneath the chairs of their owners at feasts, curled at their feet, wearing collars and even little earrings, plainly cherished members of the family. When a beloved cat died, the household was said to mourn it deeply, and in the depth of their grief, the family might shave their eyebrows as a sign of mourning, a gesture of loss for an animal that we would find extraordinary, and that tells you just how fully these creatures were woven into the heart of the home. And then the cat was carefully prepared and wrapped and laid to rest, sometimes with little offerings of food for its own journey into the afterlife, a small dish of milk or a mouse, so that the beloved companion would not go hungry in the world beyond. There is something almost unbearably sweet in that, the thought of an ancient family tucking a little food in beside their mummified cat, so that it would be fed and happy in eternity, and it closes the distance of 5,000 years in a single heartbeat. And there were other animals woven through their lives. Dogs kept and loved and used for hunting and guarding, valued companions with their own names, buried sometimes with their masters. Cattle, precious and central to the whole economy, a measure of wealth and a source of everything from milk to meat to muscle for the plough. Donkeys, the patient beasts of burden that carried the loads of Egypt on their backs. Geese and ducks and other birds kept for food, and the wild creatures too, revered and feared and made into gods, the falcon and the ibis and the jackal and the crocodile and the rest, so that the whole natural world was shot through with the divine, every creature potentially the face of a god. So an Egyptian lived surrounded by animals, useful and beloved and sacred all mingled together, in a relationship with the animal world far more intense and intimate than most modern people know. And if there is one thread of that world you would find immediately familiar, one thing that would need no explaining across all the gulf of time and adaptation, it might be this: the cat asleep in the warm doorway, loved by the family whose home it shared. Some things, thankfully, do not change at all. Let that beloved cat and all the company of animals settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the children of ancient Egypt, and to the tender and difficult truth of growing up on the banks of the Nile. Let us think, gently, about the children of ancient Egypt, because childhood is where the hardness of any ancient world shows itself most tenderly, and because it tells us so much about what daily life really meant on the banks of that river. Egyptian children, like children everywhere and in every age, played. We know this, and it is a lovely thing to know. They had toys, real toys that have survived, little carved animals, balls, dolls with movable limbs, spinning tops, games of all kinds. They played in the dust and the shallows, they swam in the safer stretches of the river, they had pets, dogs and cats and even more exotic creatures. Egyptian art shows us children being children, and the sources are full of the evident love that Egyptian parents bore their little ones, the tenderness and the delight, exactly as parents have always felt. In the good moments, an Egyptian childhood was full of warmth and play and sunshine, a barefoot childhood by a great river in a green and fertile land. But it was also, and we must say this softly, a dangerous time to be small. The great shadow over childhood everywhere in the ancient world was the terrible frequency with which children died. The dangers we have spoken of all night, the diseases, the parasites, the river, the heat, the small deadly things, all of them fell hardest on the youngest and most fragile. A great many Egyptian children did not survive to grow up, and this was a grief that touched very nearly every family, an expected sorrow, a shadow that lay over every cradle. It is the same hard truth we find in every ancient society, and it is perhaps the greatest single difference between their world and ours, this terrible, ordinary nearness of the loss of children. And the children who did survive grew up fast, by our standards. They were put to work young, helping in the fields and the home as soon as they were able, learning the skills of their parents, the boys mostly following their fathers' trades, and the girls learning the vast domestic labour of the household. Formal schooling, the learning of reading and writing, was for the tiny fortunate minority destined to be scribes, and for them it was a long, hard discipline of memorization and copying, and, by all accounts, a fair amount of the cane. For everyone else, education was simply the learning of the work they would do all their lives, absorbed at their parents' side, the endless practical knowledge of survival and craft passed down by doing. So an Egyptian childhood was a mixture, as childhood has always been, of play and love and warmth on the one hand, and hard work and ever-present danger on the other. And the children who came through it, who survived the diseases and the river and all the rest, and grew into adults, carried with them that whole deep education in how to live in that exact world, the very knowledge you would so sorely lack. They had learned, from their first steps, all the things that would keep them alive and that you would never have been taught, and that is, once again, the whole difference between them and you, laid down from the very beginning of life. Let those children of the Nile, the played with and the grieved for, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to what happened when illness came, and to the surprising sophistication and the hard limits of Egyptian medicine. When sickness or injury came, as it came so often in that hard world, the ancient Egyptians turned to their physicians, And Egyptian medicine was genuinely famous throughout the ancient world, respected far and wide, and it is a fascinating mixture of real, careful, practical knowledge and pure magic, the two woven together so tightly that the Egyptians themselves drew no line between them. On the practical side, Egyptian doctors were, by ancient standards, remarkably skilled and knowledgeable. They had a real and detailed understanding of the body, gathered in part, perhaps, from the practice of mummification and its intimate knowledge of human anatomy. They could set broken bones, and they did it well, as the healed fractures in so many skeletons attest. They treated wounds with genuine skill, using honey, which we now know has real antibacterial properties, and mouldy bread, which may have carried something of the effect we would later harness in antibiotics. They had a vast catalogue of remedies drawn from plants and minerals, some genuinely effective, built up over centuries of careful observation. There survive medical texts, written on papyrus, that lay out symptoms and diagnoses and treatments with a care and a systematic thoroughness that is genuinely impressive, describing conditions and their management in ways that command real respect. They even had specialists, doctors who concentrated on particular parts of the body, an idea so advanced it would not be common again for thousands of years. One of these surviving medical papyri is particularly astonishing because it deals with injuries and wounds in a way that is almost entirely practical and rational, working methodically through case after case, describing the injury, the examination, the diagnosis, and the treatment with a clear-eyed realism that would not look out of place in a much later age. It even, remarkably, distinguishes between cases the physician can treat, cases he might attempt, and cases he should not treat at all because they are beyond hope, an honesty and a clinical judgment that is genuinely striking to encounter across so many thousands of years. Whoever wrote that text was a real observer of the human body and its ills, thinking carefully and systematically about how to heal, and their work commands a respect that has nothing to do with making allowances for the ancientness of it. It is simply good, careful medicine, done as well as it could possibly be done, without the deeper knowledge that only much later ages would gain. And alongside all of this, entirely intertwined with it, was magic. Spells and incantations, and amulets and appeals to the gods were not a separate thing from medicine, they were part of medicine, used right alongside the honey and the bandages, because the Egyptians understood illness as having both physical and spiritual causes, and treated both at once. A doctor might set a bone and speak a spell over it, prescribe a real remedy and an incantation together, and see no contradiction whatever, because to them there was none. The physical and the magical were two aspects of one reality, and the good physician worked on both. But for all its sophistication, Egyptian medicine, like all ancient medicine, ran hard against the limits of what was possible before the modern age. They did not understand infection or contagion or the true causes of the diseases that afflicted them. They could not cure the parasites in the river, or the fevers that came in the night, or the great sicknesses that swept through from time to time. They could ease and comfort and sometimes genuinely heal, and they did all of this with real skill and care. But against the deep sicknesses they were, in the end, nearly as helpless as everyone was before our own age, and a great deal of their medicine, for all its impressive knowledge, was the tending of the sick and the easing of pain and the hoping for the best, offered with genuine compassion in the face of an enemy they could not truly defeat. So if you fell ill in ancient Egypt, from the bad water or the parasites or any of the 100 dangers, you would be tended by physicians more skilled than you might expect, who would offer you real remedies and heartfelt spells together, and who would do their genuine best for you. And it might not be enough, because it so often was not enough, for anyone in that world. but you would not be uncared for. That much, at least, the Egyptians could offer, and did. Let those skilled and limited physicians settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the great thing that stood behind all of Egyptian life, the gods, and the vast hope that shaped everything, the hope of the life beyond this one. We cannot understand ancient Egypt, or why its people endured what they endured with such apparent steadiness, without understanding the thing that stood behind everything, that gave shape and meaning to the whole of their hard lives, which was their religion, and above all their extraordinary hope about death. The Egyptians lived in a world absolutely saturated with the divine. Their gods were everywhere, in the sun that crossed the sky each day, in the river that flooded each year, in the creatures of the land and the forces of nature, a vast and complex family of deities governing every aspect of existence. And the Egyptians tended these gods with enormous care, through the great temples and their priests, through festivals and offerings and rituals, because the whole order of the world, the rising of the sun and the flooding of the river and the very continuation of life, was understood to depend on the proper maintenance of the relationship between the people and their gods. Religion was not a part of Egyptian life. It was the framework within which all of life took place, and at the heart of it, shaping everything, was their belief about what came after death, which was unlike anything else in the ancient world in its richness and its hopefulness. The Egyptians believed, deeply and in detail, in a life beyond this one, a continuation of existence in a realm that could be wonderful, a place of peace and plenty and reunion, an eternal life in the presence of the gods. This was not a vague or shadowy hope. It was elaborate, concrete, worked out in enormous detail, and it was the great project of a life, to prepare properly for the journey into it. This is why they did what they did with their dead. This is why mummification, why the tombs, why the treasures buried with the dead, why the whole vast apparatus of Egyptian death that so fascinates us. It was all in the service of this great hope, the preservation of the body so the spirit would have a home, the provision of everything the dead would need for their journey and their new eternal life. Death, for the Egyptians, was not an ending but a passage, a frightening and dangerous passage that had to be prepared for with the greatest care, but a passage to something that could be glorious, an eternity of life renewed. And you can see, can you not, how such a belief would change the experience of a hard life. If this life, with all its labour and danger and grief, was not the whole story, but only the first part of it, a preparation for an eternal life to come, then the hardship could be borne differently, held within a much larger frame of hope. The farmer breaking his back in the field, the mother grieving her lost child, the worker worn down by labour, all of them lived within this great overarching promise that existence did not end at the grave, that the ones they lost were not gone forever, that beyond the hard labour of this world lay the possibility of eternal peace. It does not remove the hardship, but it holds it and gives it meaning and offers a hope to carry through the dark, and that is no small thing, and it was perhaps the greatest gift that Egyptian civilization gave to the people who lived within it. And their vision of that eternal life is worth dwelling on, gently, because it is so warm and so human. The Egyptians did not imagine the afterlife as a strange or abstract or frightening place. They imagined it, for the most part, as a better version of the life they already knew and loved. A land of fields and rivers, like Egypt but perfected, where the crops grew tall and the harvests never failed, where one dwelt in peace and plenty among the people one loved, in a country very like the beautiful green valley of the Nile, but without its hardships and its griefs. They called one vision of it the Field of Reeds, and it was, in essence, ancient Egypt made perfect and eternal, the same beloved world of river and field and family and sunshine, going on forever, free of pain and loss. There is something deeply touching in that, I think, that when they imagined paradise, they imagined their own world made perfect, because they loved their world, for all its hardness. They did not wish to escape to some utterly different realm. They wished for more of what they had, done right and lasting forever, the river and the fields and the family and the warm sun, purified of suffering and extended into eternity. It tells you that underneath all the labor and the danger, the Egyptians found their lives good and worth living and worth continuing forever, and that is a beautiful thing to know about them, and a beautiful thing to rest upon. And it meant that death, though feared as a dangerous passage, was not the end of hope, but very nearly its fulfillment, the doorway to the perfected eternal version of everything one loved. The Egyptian, laying their dead to rest with such care and such expense and such elaborate preparation, was not surrendering them to oblivion, but equipping them for the journey to that better country, the field of reeds, where they would live again, whole and happy, forever. And they expected, in time, to follow and to be reunited there, in the eternal Egypt beyond the grave. It is one of the most hopeful visions of death that any people has ever held, and it lit the whole of their hard lives with its promise. Let those gods and that great hope settle gently in the dark. We turn now, gently, toward the close of our night, and back to you, and to what this whole long journey down the Nile has really been telling us. So let us draw it together now, softly, as you drift, because underneath our whole affectionate tour of ancient Egypt, there has been a single gentle idea, and I want to give it to you whole before you sleep. You would not last a day in ancient Egypt. We have seen all the reasons why. The sun that would defeat your unadapted body, the river full of parasites your gut had never met, the animals you would not know to fear, and the small deadly things you would not know to avoid, the heat and the labor your body was never built for, the language you could not understand, that would cut you off from all the life-saving knowledge everyone around you carried. You would be helpless there, and it would not be your fault, and it would not be because you are weak or soft or lesser in any way. It would be because you are a creature exquisitely adapted to a completely different world, set down suddenly in one you were never made for. And the whole point, the thing I most want you to carry into sleep, is the fairness of it, the humbling and rather beautiful fairness. Because the ancient Egyptian would not last a day in your world either. Every single thing that makes you helpless there has its exact mirror. They would be baffled by your machines as you would be by their river. They would be lost in your roaring cities as you would be in their desert. They could not read your writing or speak your language any more than you could theirs. The heat-hardened farmer who could haul stone all day at Giza would be as defeated by your world as you would be by his, and the difference, in both directions, is not worth or strength or virtue. It is simply adaptation. Each of you is a marvel, perfectly fitted to your own world, and perfectly lost in the other. And there is something genuinely comforting in that, I think, something that lifts the whole thing up at the end. Because it means that the gulf between you and those ancient people is not a gulf of quality, not a matter of them being tougher or you being feebler. It is a gulf of circumstance, of the particular world each of you was shaped by. And that means that underneath all the differences, in the things that actually matter, you are the same kind of creature, adaptable and clever and enduring, shaped by your world as they were shaped by theirs. Drop an Egyptian baby into your world and raise it here, and it would grow up as capable in your world as you are, reading and driving and managing the machines. Drop you as a baby into theirs, and you would grow up hauling water and reading the river and fearing the right animals, as capable there as they were. The difference between you is not in the child. It is only in the world the child is raised in. So the ancient Egyptians were not another kind of being, remote and alien and unknowable. They were us, exactly us, the same creature, living in a different world, shaped by it as we are shaped by ours, loving their children and fearing their dangers and hoping for their eternity, doing the best they could with the world they were given, exactly as we do with ours. And across all the thousands of years, that sameness is the truest thing, and the most comforting, and a good thing to hold as you sink towards sleep. They were us, we are them. Only the world is different. And I want to add one more turn to this, because it reaches even further and is even gentler. It is not only the ancient Egyptians who were us. It is everyone, across all of time, in every world that has ever been. Every human being who has ever lived was a creature perfectly adapted to their own particular world and would have been lost in any other. And each of them was, underneath that adaptation, the same kind of being as you, capable of the same love and fear and hope and endurance. The gulf we imagine between ourselves and the people of the past, that sense that they were somehow lesser or stranger or made of different stuff, is an illusion every time. They were always just people in a different world, doing their best, exactly like us. And that means you are part of something vast and unbroken, a single great family of human beings stretching back across all the thousands of years, each generation adapted to its own world, each one the same underneath, all of them your kin. The Egyptian farmer, the pyramid builder, the scribe, the mother grieving her child, the old man watching the river rise. They are not strangers to you across an unbridgeable gulf. They are your distant family, the same creature you are, and the only thing that separates you is the accident of which world each of you was born into. And there is a deep comfort in that belonging, in knowing that you are not alone in your own moment but part of a great long line of people, all of them fundamentally like you, all of them having faced their own worlds with the same human heart you carry now. So when you think of ancient Egypt, do not think of it as a strange and distant and alien place, full of people unlike yourself. Think of it as one more room in the great house of humanity, full of your own distant family, living their lives as best they could, exactly as you live yours. You would not last a day in their world, and they would not last a day in yours, and that difference is real and worth understanding. But underneath it, in everything that finally matters, you are one and the same, and always were, and that is the gentlest and truest thing to carry down into sleep. And notice as you drift how the whole of tonight has quietly turned itself around. We began, it seemed, with a story about your weakness, about all the ways you would fail and falter and die on the banks of the Nile. And it has become, by the end, a story about your kinship, about how deeply you belong to the great human family that includes those ancient people, about how the very things that would defeat you there are only the mirror of the things that would defeat them here, and how underneath all of it, you are the same enduring, adaptable, hopeful creature they were. The story of why you would not last a day has become the story of why you are, in the end, exactly like them, and they like you. That is a gentler place to arrive than where we started, and a truer one, because the point was never really to make you feel small, or soft, or unfit. The point was to show you, by the long way round, through all the dangers and the differences, just how astonishing a thing it is to be a human being, fitted so perfectly to a world, carrying so deep a knowledge of it, and how that same astonishing fittedness has belonged to every human being who ever lived, in every world there has ever been. You are a marvel fitted to your world. They were marvels fitted to theirs. And the wonder of it, the real wonder, is not the difference between you, but the sameness underneath, the same bright human spark, shining in every one of them, as it shines in you, across all the thousands of years, unbroken and unchanged. Let that deep sameness settle gently in the dark. We turn now, at the very last, back to your own world, and to the safety and comfort of the bed you lie in, so far from the banks of that ancient river. There is nothing left to survive tonight. The journey is over, the long day on the Nile is done, and you can let the whole of that ancient world grow quiet now, and dim, and drift away into the warm dark. Let the hammering sun go down over the desert, and the heat drain out of the sand, and the cool of the Egyptian night come down over the fields and the river. Let the great river run on in the dark, with its parasites and its crocodiles and its sleeping hippos, and let it be far away, on the other side of 5,000 years, where it cannot touch you. Let the pyramid builders lay down their tools and go home to their village, to their bread and their beer, and rest. Let the farmers come in from the fields, and the miners up from the dark, and the embalmers set down their work, and let all of them, all those long ago people, so like you underneath everything, go to their rest, as they did every night when the sun went down over the Nile. Let the scribe set down his reed pen, and the physician close his papyrus of remedies, and the mother settle her children to sleep on the cool roof under the great desert stars. Let the cat curl warm in the doorway. Let the last lamps go out in the mud-brick houses, one by one, all along the river, and the villages fall silent, and the whole green valley sink into the dark, held safe between the deserts, under the wheeling stars, as it was every single night for thousands upon thousands of years. Let all of ancient Egypt, the whole vast living world of it, lie down and sleep, as it has now slept for so long, its labours over, its griefs long healed, its people at their eternal rest in the perfected fields they dreamed of. And come home, all the way home, to here and now and this. To your own bed, in your own room, in the world you actually were built for, the world you know exactly how to live in, where the water is clean and the sun is managed, and no snake waits in the dark, and no parasite lurks in your drink. You are not on the Nile. You never have to be. You are exactly where you belong, in the world that made you, safe and adapted and at home. Let your body grow heavy now, and still. Let the last of the day's weight sink out of your shoulders, out of your hands, out of your legs, down into the soft and holding dark. Let your breath move slow and low and easy, all on its own, asking nothing of you. There is nothing to survive tonight, and nothing to adapt to, and nothing to fear. You are in your own world, the one you were made for, the one that fits you as the Nile fitted them. And it is night, and you are safe, and the whole long day, this one and all the thousands before it, can be set down now and left to the dark. You are home, you are safe, you are exactly where you belong, and you can rest now, completely, and let the ancient river run on without you, far away, in the gentle distance of the past. Good night, traveller. Rest easy, sleep deep. I'll be here, somewhere in the quiet, when you wake.